In today's lesson, we're going to get into the second of our three exposure controls. Today we're going to talk about the aperture and how it works and what its effects are. You may remember that the aperture is the hole in the lens that lets light in. And I have this film camera here because it allows you to see the effect. Is that when I turn this ring, as I turn the ring, you can see the hole getting bigger or smaller. The reason I'm using this lens is because it was done mechanically back in the film days. Now it's done electronically, so you really can't see it on your camera. But that's how it's working, is that when you change the aperture, you're changing the size of the hole that's allowing light into the camera, so that when you create an exposure, either with a large aperture, there's a rush of a lot of light into the camera, or with a small aperture, there's a restricted amount of light that's being allowed into the camera. And you'll set that on your camera. Basically, in many cameras, there'll be, well, all cameras will have this little dial up here by where your index finger goes. And typically that's where you'll be changing your shutter speed. So many cameras have this dial on the back here that you can turn in manual mode, and that will change your aperture. Other cameras won't have this dial. What you'll end up doing is pressing a button somewhere on it. Usually it's like a plus minus button. And then while you're pressing it, you'll turn this dial up here that would otherwise control your shutter speed. And so that's how you manipulate it. And you'll just have to look at your own camera and see how it goes. What we want to do now is just get you to understand this control and its effects, because this is the most confusing exposure control. If you can get your head around this one, everything's going to be just fine. So I'm going to devote an entire video to just understanding it here, and that's what we're going to do now. Like I mentioned earlier, for every exposure control, there's a trade-off. In other words, that why wouldn't you just make the aperture really big every time and let a whole bunch of light in and make your life easier? Well, it's because there's a trade-off here, like there are with every exposure control. That trade-off is something called depth of field. Depth of field refers to the distance away from whatever you're focused at that remains sharp. Okay? Whatever you're focused on will be sharp. Okay? Then, depending on your depth of field, things that get further away will either stay sharp or they'll get blurry right away. Now, if that didn't make any sense to you, don't worry. The best way to visualize this is two sort of competing things. A deep depth of field, think landscape. Okay? In a landscape context, what you want and what landscape photographers are always doing is using a small aperture to create a wide depth of field. Because think about it, they want everything sharp from front to back. Okay? That's a deep depth of field. Conversely, think about it this way. Think about a portrait photographer or somebody that's taking pictures of people. What they care about is the person and not the background. And in fact, usually the background is a distraction. They would just as soon have the whole thing blurred out. And so what they'll do is focus on the person and then use a large aperture, with the idea being that the background gets blurred out. And that is a shallow depth of field, because now, everything as you go away gets blurry. Okay? So going back to what we talked about, a large aperture then creates a shallow depth of field, meaning that everything gets blurry really fast as you move away from your point of focus. And then when you use the smaller aperture, it restricts light, but you get this deeper depth of field. So there's your trade-off. Now, let's talk about how this is measured. We talked about in ISO how it's measured. It's nice and clean and easy. It goes from 100 to 200 to 400 to 800 and so on. In the case of aperture, it's not so clean, and this is where the confusion begins. The first thing is this, that the larger the number, the smaller the aperture. You can always tell you're looking at an aperture number because it'll start with an F with a slash. You'll see like f/4, f/22, f/2.8, whatever. But if an f with a slash and then a number, that means you're looking at the aperture. So if you look at your camera and wherever you see the f will usually be your measurement. But the key is, you'd think that the bigger the aperture, the bigger the number. But that's not the way it works. That the bigger the number, the smaller the aperture. And that's because the measurement of aperture is actually a ratio from focal length to the size of the aperture. And so you have to think about it almost like it's a fraction, so that, you know, the larger the number, then the smaller the aperture. So that's the first sort of confusing issue. The second thing is that there's no doubling. We talked about in ISO, nice and clean. You want to go from one stop, one doubling of light, say from ISO 100, well, it's ISO 200. Nice, easy, simple. In the case of aperture, it's not that clean. I'm going to show you on your screen now a list of aperture numbers in one-stop increments. As you can see, they don't double. There's no seeming relationship between them, but these are your aperture numbers in one-stop increments. What's more to this situation is that it's different depending on what lens you use. That basically the larger aperture will be different on sort of lens A versus lens B. So what you have to do is look at your lens and then look at the number on it, and whatever the F number is will be the largest aperture. Now, there's yet one more confusing element, which is some lenses are variable aperture lenses, meaning that the maximum aperture is different depending on what focal length you're at. So the more you zoom in, then the smaller the aperture. Now, what's happening here is the aperture is actually not changing, but again, remember I mentioned that the measurement depends on focal length. So the more you increase the focal length, the smaller you're making the number, okay? So you're not actually changing the aperture, but I wanted you to understand that if you have a variable aperture lens, and many of you will because it's a kit lens that comes with your camera, and almost all of them are variable aperture. So as you zoom in, you're gonna watch that F number go up, usually to something like f5.6. Okay, so you're not doing anything wrong. That's just the way it works in a variable aperture lens. But it just adds to confusion of this situation. So in the end, we have this setting that makes no sense. The numbers get smaller as the size gets larger. The numbers don't double, and it's different on all sorts of lenses. So what do you do? Well, the answer is, what you need to do is you simply need to memorize the scale. I'm going to show it again on your screen. It's going to be in the written materials as well. There's only 7 numbers, but just do yourself a favor and memorize these 7 numbers. These are aperture measurements in one-stop increments on common lenses. One thing to keep in mind, though, is when you're making these changes on your camera, remember that your camera moves typically in third stop increments. So to get in between these numbers is going to take 3 clicks of the dial. Let's talk about how this gets applied in practice. I referred to it as a trade-off, but a lot of times you just have a desired outcome and you go with it. Again, I'm going to use the 2 examples of portrait and landscape because it's really obvious and really simple. In a landscape context, what you're almost always going to want to do is use a moderate to small aperture because you're trying to get a wide depth of field. That's one of the reasons why you see so many landscape photographers using tripods. They're restricting the light via the aperture, so they have to use a longer shutter speed, and so they have to stabilize the camera so they don't have any movement. Conversely, if you're somebody that's like a portrait photographer or a street photographer or somebody that's taking pictures of people, then you're just going to make that aperture really big. You're going to use a small number, something like f2.8, f4, something like that. Now, not only are you allowing a lot of light into your camera, but you're actually blurring out the background, which is what you want. And so what we call a trade-off isn't really a trade-off in that context, which is kind of cool. Anyway, That's how you'll use it when you're taking pictures of people. In other contexts where you just don't know, where you just don't care, f8 is what a lot of people use. In fact, there's a saying, which is f8 and forget it, or f8 and be there, just referring to, f8 is sort of a moderate one. Just get there, get the shot, and use this moderate aperture. So if you don't care, that might be a way to go. Let's talk about this in practice as well. And what I want to do here is show you some examples, and hopefully this will make sense to you, okay? Now, first, I'm going to show you 3 pictures, and these are pictures of a chessboard that I took years ago just as an illustration. In the first one, you can see there's a very shallow depth of field. I'm focused on the front chess piece, and you can see I'm using a large aperture, which is a small number, and that the piece in the background is very blurry. Now take a look at the second picture, and this one I'm using a moderate aperture. So our number is getting bigger as the aperture gets smaller. We're using a middle-sized one here, and look what's happening is that you're starting to see a more definite shape to the piece in the background. It's starting to look a little bit sharper. So now hopefully this shows you what's happening as you use a smaller aperture and you get a deeper depth of field. Let's finish this off showing you a third one. Now you have a very small aperture, so it's restricting the amount of light that's allowed into the camera, but you've got this deeper depth of field, so now you can really see the piece in the background. So hopefully these 3 shots show you how it works and make things clear to you. Let me show you one more example. This was actually not in a sort of controlled environment, but just out and about. And I took the exact same shot with a wide aperture. So look at this one, and you can see how the background is blurred out. Now let me show you the exact same shot with a smaller aperture. This restricted the amount of light, but now you can see the whole background, and it's much clearer. Neither's right, neither's wrong. For example, if you wanted to focus on a flower in the foreground and you didn't want the background so predominant in the picture, then a wide or a large aperture might be the ticket. But if you want the whole thing, then you want a smaller aperture so that you can get the deep depth of field. And that leads us to today's assignment. What I want you to do is go set up your own chessboard, as it were. Not really a chessboard, but find 3 things and put them in a row. Set up your camera, and a tripod will help here because you can keep it in the same place and keep the same shot framed up. If you don't have one, that's okay. Just try to keep the shots the same. But if you do have one, go ahead and use it so you can set this up. All I want you to do is use the same focus point for all of them, space the pieces out, but take 3 shots with a wide open aperture, okay, one with a moderate aperture, and then one with a small aperture. That's going to show you 2 things. It's going to show you the effect of light coming into the cameras because you're going to have to make offsetting moves. And it's also going to show you what happens with depth of field. When you're done, take a look at the pictures and you'll be able to see the effects that happen to your shot. And that'll start hopefully making this whole aperture thing makes sense to you. Like I said, this part can be confusing. If you're a little confused right now, don't worry. We're going to continue working with this. The next 2 videos are going to be using Aperture. And right now, I'm just trying to introduce you to it. So we'll reinforce it as we go. Anyway, go ahead and work on that assignment. And then when you're done, come back and we'll delve more into Aperture.